Hi, welcome to class. I hope you enjoyed the next two chapters of Dispossession and the Environment. So in this PowerPoint, in this lecture, I want to do something a little different than we have been doing. Just because between this and the writing workshop, there's a lot of lecture material. So I think the best way, what I'm doing in this presentation is I'm going to go through the 4 body chapters of Dispossession and the Environment. And I'm going to talk about the kind of basic ideas of each chapter and pull out some examples to make that, to kind of clarify what that looks like. I'll also cover some definitions that she uses that are probably not super familiar to all of y'all. But the way I would encourage you to do this is use this PowerPoint as a study guide or a resource, right? To help you, if there's an area that you're confused about, to learn more about that. Or to kind of, see if I can't help clarify it. But because it is a lot of material, feel free to skip around, do some here and some there. As long, in terms of the writing guide, the writing workshop, try and get through the writing workshop before you turn in your paper, but you don't need to do it all at once. Just kind of, basically what I'm saying is be strategic with how you use this as a resource for getting at dispossession in the environment, and the writing resource, the writing workshop, which is really aimed at making sure everyone's on the same page in terms of writing and expectations, but for some of you, maybe review. So be strategic. Use this as a kind of review or clarification tool. But the real focus for the meat of the discussion should be on writing about in the discussion groups about the chapters and pulling that kind of stuff apart. I think that a little background on the different chapters can help clarify them, and maybe that would be helpful for some people. But ultimately, I think the really important things, even if you didn't understand every bit of every single chapter, I suspect that everyone got by far enough to have a good conversation, as is, about this book. So the first body chapter is really about Australian surfers and the way in which Australian surfers understand Papua New Guinea and Papua New Guineans. So keep in mind, again, the point of Paige West's book, her main argument is she's interested in colonial representations of Papua New Guinea and how these ultimately reproduce or create forms of dispossession. And so surfing, of course, is a practice. It's a tourist practice, right? She talks a lot about Australian surfers who come to visit PNG. And when we think about tourism, right, one of the things she points out is that tourism is really about the circulation and consumption of images. Think about images of Hawaii that you see on the news. It's not on the news, but that you see of Hawaii as a kind of paradise, right, that make you want to go visit it. Think of tourism commercials where they try and create places and represent places as desirable, as destinations that people want to visit. And one of the ways in which that can be done, as Paige West points out, is by framing landscapes like Papua New Guinea as natural, as environmentally pristine, or as exotic, as culturally exotic, the home of exotics, of exotic others. And so what happens here, right, is that these kinds of images, these mass-produced images, create what she calls a modernist temporality, or an understanding of time that is especially modernist. And this is another way of saying basically the same ideas of social evolutionism. The idea that there are more primitive peoples who are stuck in the past and more advanced civilized people at the top of the social hierarchy. She uses a few different words to talk about these things. So she talks a lot about spatiotemporal dynamics, basically spatial and temporal. And what she's pointing to here is that when people represent Papua New Guineans as primitive, as prior to civilization, in this kind of colonial way of thinking, the idea is that physical geographies, physical places, come to be associated with the past, whereas other places come to be, like, for example, a mall or NASA, come to be associated with futurity, the NASA building. And the idea, right, is that this is ultimately a cultural trick, because people in Papua New Guinea and scientists at NASA ultimately live in the exact same moment of time in the same global structures. But the cultural trick of these modernist temporalities, or what Paige West talks about as spatiotemporal dynamics, right, is this trick that makes us think of Papua New Guineans or other colonized peoples as existing in a prior historical moment, as our ancestors today, so to speak. Another word she uses to talk about this is, chronotopes. That's another jargony word that for the purposes of this class you don't need to know. I'm happy to talk about it more in office hours if you want to know more about it. So going back to surfers, right? One of the things that she talks about surfers as being really interested in is these representations of pristine and primitive landscapes. There's a whole rhetoric of surfers wanting to discover the next secret place, right? And there's a whole set of cultural values that have to do with freedom, being in the zone, and discovery. And all of which frames Papua New Guinea as a destination because it's understood by these Australian surfers to be pristine, a pristine environment, kind of previous beyond a world prior to capitalist expansion, right? So it's a very romantic understanding. The idea is that Papua New Guineans have not been tainted by capitalism in the same way Australia has been. But ultimately, when we talk about these kinds of ideologies, these romantic and paternalistic images of Papua New Guineans, what we see, right, is that surfers are ultimately self-fashioning their own identities. They're imagining Papua New Guineans not as they are, but as a foil to everything that they think is wrong in the world and everything that they want to be. It's a kind of foil to their own identity as the real deal, the authentic surfers who are not just caught up in this commodity tourism, but interested in finding these natural landscapes and primitive peoples. So again, even though it appears to be settlers representing Papua New Guineans, what they're really doing is constructing their own identity as white people. The second body chapter, then shifts from tourism to capacity building and international development. And so one of the things that Paige West does is she points to this common refrain that says Papua New Guineans don't have the capacity to manage large conservation funds or international development funds. Capacity in this context could refer to the institutional capacity and organizational capacity, to the individual capacity, the ability to manage money in accordance with Eurocentric bourgeois values. And so one of the things, the kind of crux of this chapter then, which Paige West is pointing to, right, is that this whole idea of capacity building ultimately locates the problem in Papua New Guinean people and society, right? They become the problem that needs to be solved through, for example, education efforts. They need to be taught how to manage money, or they need to have external international development organizations brought in to do this work for them. Now, the problem with this idea of capacity building, besides that it frames Papua New Guinean people as the problem of global inequality, what's the result of global inequality, or what's the cause of global inequality? Well, it's not these international systems, it's Papua New Guineans, just kind of being behind and backwards. So the problem here is that obscures structural histories and constraints, and it re-articulates colonial notions of indigenous peoples and societies that are defined in terms of an inherent lack, right? They're lacking something that more civilized peoples have. They're defined in terms of what they don't have. Now, in terms of these two concepts, these two kind of core pieces of the point, there were really two lovely examples of what that looks like in concrete terms. The first one, and I'm going to go from the bottom and go up, is the story of Seku, who attends this capacity building workshop. Because the idea is she attends this workshop because she wants to build skills that will help her build a loan or get a loan so she can build her business. But the problem that she runs into, right, is that in order to get a loan, she finds out she has to have what are called fixed assets. And one of the primary forms of a fixed asset is land. But the problem is that land is not privately owned where she lives. It's collectively owned. And so that form of quote-unquote fixed assets is just simply not available to her by function of the kind of larger organization of Papua New Guinean society and economies. By the function, right, of these kinds of the cultural assumptions of bank managers who assume that people should have certain kinds of wealth in a way that doesn't actually work with indigenous histories in Papua New Guinea, which do privilege, for example, collectively owned land and inalienable forms of land that you can't sell. Because as she discusses in later chapters, right, the land is part of who you are as a person, and that's not a metaphor. Who you are as a person is a gift from the land. And of course, that's not such a strange idea because we all exist in place. We all sustain ourselves from land. Like, that's just the nature of existence. But there is also a spiritual component to Papua New Guinean ideologies and understandings of that process. So anyway, back to Seku, right? So she finds she just doesn't have fixed assets that the bank will recognize. She asks, what about my money in the bank? I have plenty of money in the bank. Will that work? And they say, no, that's not a fixed asset because we're not convinced that Papua New Guinean peoples know how to save that, right? There's too much like gift exchange and things like that. And so again, you see this paternalistic idea as well as a set of cultural assumptions guiding things like bank loans, in which you have capacity building at workshops on the one hand that are meant to provide individuals with skills, but then there's a gap between that and the structural reality of banks requiring certain forms of wealth that simply are not accessible to Papua New Guinean people. So the problem is not internal to Seku. The problem has to do with the larger social structures and institutions. The second lovely example has to do with hierarchies in terms of who gets funding. Paige West talks a lot about how her own, this NGO that she works with, non-governmental agency, that's mostly run in large part by Papua New Guinean nationals, is unable to get these grants from these international agencies. And the reason for that is because they don't think this organization has enough capacity when compared to a larger international organization, right? They don't have the same organizational infrastructure to get projects done. And so they don't get grants, and the grants go to these international developers. But the irony, of course, is that the international developers then contract with these smaller Papua New Guinean organizations to do a lot of the actual work. And as a result, the Papua New Guinean organizations, the people who work at them are often paid very depressed prices, very low wages, to do this work. And so they become a source of labor, a source of cheap labor, but are not given managerial or direct control over the projects. And as Paige West describes in her chapter on environmental science and the politics of discovery, right, there are certain rhetorical forms in environmental science or genre conventions that have to do with how you write. And these are quite different from the genre conventions for gimme forms of knowledge and more forms of building and renewing relationships with marsupials. And it's not that it's like these are two separate cultures, right? Because European scientists, American scientists also have poetry, but at the same time, gimme knowledge formations are not necessarily geared towards this kind of literal modes of representations and depersonalized modes of representations exclusively, in a way that, you know, in the United States, we do consider science and poetry to be different genres, different forms of writing. These kinds of categories get divided up differently for different folks, though. And so I've pulled out this quote because this quote is really, I think, crystallizes the point of the chapter. And what she points out in this quote is that when foreign scientists come traveling to Papua New Guinea, one of the things that they do is they articulate this kind of ideology that they're going to discover these important these important pieces of knowledge that were previously unknown. We say the same logic with the surfers, right, who want to discover these unknown surfing spots that are kind of untapped by the larger global world. But again, just like with the surfers, what we see with this discovery is that it's a rhetorical strategy that erases Papua New Guineans' own understandings of places, understandings of these landscapes and these animals and relationships with animals. And so this kind of ties into a broader point that has to do with what I would call citational, the politics of who we cite, which is to say that in all of the foreign research teams that Paige West has known, they rely on the expertise of national scientists, but those national scientists and local researchers don't get cited as much as international or foreign researchers. Likewise, indigenous peoples who often are consulting for scientists and leading scientists don't get cited. So there's this way in which this logic of discovering the new scientific discovery functions to erase Papua New Guinean peoples and erase Papua New Guinean modes of knowing and modes of being in relationship and existing within these more than human worlds. And so as she points out, that's a kind of erasure. That's a kind of dispossession. There was one piece extra that I should have mentioned, right? And this is going to come back in the discussion questions at the end, which is that this kind of rhetoric of discovery, whether it's used by surfers or scientists, has a kind of similar force to it, a similar dynamic, where it draws on these kinds of romantic colonial images of intrepid explorers and European heroes who discover these uncivilized lands, right? And there's a way in which scientists ultimately end up reenacting these colonial logics, these colonial understandings of selfhood, of the world as it is, in a way that we can understand as actually quite violent, as quite problematic. And this is a kind of nice example of the way in which anthropology can speak back to other disciplinary forms like environmental science and say, okay, but in this case, right, we can look and see how the ways in which scientists are doing research and coming to know the world are not value neutral. They're not prior to culture. They actually reflect a cultural set of assumptions and orientations and ways of being in the world and relating to the universe that we can't really take to be universal. Okay, this slide's going to have 3 audio clips, but bear with me. I had another story to really illustrate what I mean by the colonial politics of this concept of discovery. And this comes from a colleague of mine, an archaeologist who worked at Brandeis. And he talks about how when he did these documentary films, because a lot of people get really excited about archaeology and they want to watch these documentaries about these ancient finds and hidden places, right? So he'd been working on this pretty large Mayan city. And these filmmakers came to him and wanted to do a documentary about his work there. And so to film the opening scene, they wanted to have a scene of the archaeologists taking with their what's the word for this? It's like a big sword almost used for cutting through jungle. What? Machete. Using their machetes to cut through the jungle to get to the city, this ancient Mayan city. And so the filmmakers took them along to the outskirts of the city, into the jungle. Again, here we see this metaphorical, the cultural value of the jungle as untamed primitive wilderness. And they wanted to film them chopping through this area. But here's the thing, right? Like, there's a path. There's a nice maintained path that goes straight into the site from the nearest town. And so the camera people set up all their equipment in the path, but then had the archaeologists off the path pretending to cut through the jungle until they got to the site and pretended to see it for the first time as if they were just discovering it. Even though, of course, they'd been excavating the site for years at this point. But in these kinds of public media forms, right, there's this aesthetics or value of discovery, right, in which people get really excited about this idea that they are learning this secret that's being uncovered for them. And by making these Mayan cities into a secret hidden into the jungle, these documentary people can cultivate a sense of excitement in which viewers get to be part of this project of discovering unknown civilizations. And so in the last body chapter, Paige West really takes this last point I made and carries it forward. If we can't take environmental science to be pre-cultural or culturally neutral, but instead we have to understand how it reflects a particular set of colonial histories and assumptions about what it is to be in the world and be in relationship with human and non-human others, right? Then the next step is for her to ask, how do we understand the world from the perspective of gimme philosophies? Can we as scholars draw on gimme philosophical traditions in the same ways we might draw on more Eurocentric philosophical traditions? And what happens to our scholarship when we do that? She also says in the section immediately following this quote that how also can we draw not only on gimme philosophies, but gimme representational norms, gimme rhetorical strategies as an alternative to these kinds of objectifying and object-oriented languages of dominant forms of scientific inquiry, right? We can think of, and by that I mean, right, the kinds of scientific explorations and discoveries, quote unquote, that Paige West was talking about in the previous chapter, are oriented around this assumption that the world exists not as a set of relations primarily, but rather self-contained individuals and objects that pre-exist those relationships, right? And the idea being that good knowledge should be objective, it should be object-orienting, and it should be objectifying. So how do we break from those kinds of representational strategies in a way that might be more might generate a more culturally relativistic science and even a more culturally relativistic way of doing anthropology as a field of study? So I don't want to go too deep into that because I want to leave that an open-ended question as something that you guys can discuss more in the discussion bit in the discussion board. As always, these questions are meant to give you a structure. If there's something else you really want to talk about, go for it.